Hey there, this is Mr. Chu, and this is Mr. Chu Reads Books. Today's book, we're actually doing a short story. This is by Hans Christian Andersen. It's a short story, and it's called Big Klaus and Little Klaus. Of course, if you like what you see, you like what you hear, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. After that, we'll see what comes up next. Little Klaus and Big Klaus, Hans Christian Andersen. Once upon a time, there lived in a village two men who had the same name. They were both called Klaus. But one of them owned four horses, while the other only had one. So, to tell them apart, the richer man was called Big Klaus, and the poor one, Little Klaus. Now, let's hear what happened to the two of them, because that's the real story. 6 days a week, Little Klaus had to work for Big Klaus and loan him his horse. And in return, Big Klaus had to let Little Klaus borrow his four horses on Sunday. One day a week, Little Klaus felt as if all the horses belonged to him, and he would crack his whip in the air and shout orders to them merrily. One morning, while the sun was shining brightly and the villagers all dressed up in their Sunday best, with their prayer books under their arms, were passing his field, Little Klaus cracked his whip in the air, whistled, and called out very loudly, "Gee up, all my horses!" "You mustn't say that," exclaimed Big Klaus. "Only one of those horses is yours." But Little Klaus forgot very quickly what Big Klaus had said, and the next time someone went by and nodded kindly in his direction, he shouted, "Gee up, all my horses!" Big Klaus turned around and shouted, "I beg you for the last time not to call all those horses yours, because if you do it once more, I'll take the mallet that I used to drive in the stake for tethering my four horses, and I'll hit your own one horse so hard it'll drop dead on the spot." "I promise never to say it again," said Little Klaus meekly. But the words were hardly out of his mouth when still another group of churchgoers stopped by to watch him plow. They smiled and said good morning in a very friendly way. What a fine figure I must cut, driving five horses, he thought, and without realizing what he was doing, he cracked the whip and he cried, "Gee up, all my horses!" "I'll give your horse a gee up!" screamed Big Klaus in a rage, and he took his tethering mallet and he hit Little Klaus's only horse so hard on the forehead that it fell down quite dead. "Oh, poor me!" cried Little Klaus. "Now I don't have any horse at all!" And he sat down and wept. But as there was nothing else to do, he flayed his horse and hung the hide up to dry. When the wind had done its work, Little Klaus put the hide in a sack and set off for town to sell it in the marketplace. It was a long way, and the road led through a forest. The weather turned bad, and among the dark shadows, Little Klaus lost his way. He turned first in one direction, then in another. Finally, he did find his way again, but by then it was late afternoon and too late to reach town before nightfall. Not far from the road, he saw a farmhouse. The shutters were closed, but above them shone tiny streams of light. "There I must ask for shelter for the night," Little Klaus thought, and he made his way to the front door and knocked. The farmer's wife answered the door, but when she heard what he wanted, she shook her head. "You'll have to go away," she ordered. "My husband isn't home, and I cannot allow a stranger to come in." "Then I'll have to sleep outside," said Little Klaus. The farmer's wife shut the door without another word, and Little Klaus looked about him. Now, near the house was a haystack, and between that and the dwelling there was a shed with a flat thatched roof. "I'll stretch out on that," Little Klaus mumbled, looking at the roof. "It'll make a fine bed, and I doubt the stork will fly down and bite me." The latter was said in jest because there was a stork's nest on the roof of the farmhouse. Little Klaus climbed up on the roof of the shack, and while he was twisting and turning to make himself comfortable, he realized that from where he lay, he could see right into the kitchen of the farmhouse because at the top, the shutters didn't close tightly. A fine white linen cloth covered the large table, and on it were not only a roast and wine, but a platter of fish as well. On one side of the table sat the farmer's wife, and on the other, the deacon. And while she filled his glass with wine, he filled himself with fish because that was his favorite food. Oh, I wish I'd been invited too, little Klaus sighed, and he pushed himself as near to the window as he could without touching the shutters. There was cake on the table too, and this was better than a party. This was a feast. He heard someone galloping on the road, and he turned and saw the rider. It was the farmer coming home. Now, this farmer was known for two things: one, that he was a good fellow, and the other, that he suffered from a strange disease. He couldn't bear the sight of the deacon. One glance, and he went into a rage, and that, of course, was the reason why the deacon had come visiting on a day when the farmer wasn't at home. And that, too, was why the farmer's wife had made the most delicious food she could for her guest. When they heard the farmer riding up to the door of his home, both the farmer's wife and the deacon were terrified, and she told him to climb into a large empty chest that stood in the corner. The poor man, trembling with fear, obeyed her. Then the woman hid all the food and all the wine in the oven, for she knew that if her husband saw all the delicacies, he was certain to ask why she had made them. Oh, groaned little Klaus when he saw the last of the food disappear into the bread oven. Is there someone up there? The farmer called, and when he saw little Klaus lying on the roof of the shed, he told him come down. What are you doing up there? Little Klaus explained that he had lost his way in the forest and asked the farmer to be allowed if he could spend the night in the house. You're most welcome, said the farmer, who was the kindest of men, so long as there was no deacon in sight. But first, let's have a bite to eat. The farmer's wife greeted them both very politely, set the table, and served them a large bowl of porridge. The farmer, who was very hungry, ate with relish, but little Klaus kept thinking of all the delicious food in the oven, and he couldn't swallow a spoonful. At his feet under the table lay the sack with the horsehide in it. He stepped on the sack, and the horsehide squealed. Shh, shh, whispered little Klaus to the sack. But at the same time, he pressed his foot down on it even harder, and it squeaked even louder. What's that you got in the bag? Asked the farmer. Oh, it's only a wizard, little Klaus replied. He was telling me that there's no reason for us to eat porridge when he has just conjured both fish and meat for us, even a cake. Look in the oven. What? Exclaimed the farmer, and he ran to the oven and he opened it. Then he saw all the good food that his wife had made for the deacon, and she, not daring to tell the truth, silently served the roast, the fish, and the cake. After he had taken a few mouthfuls, little Klaus stepped on the sack again so that the hide squeaked. What's the wizard saying now? Asked the farmer eagerly. He says that he has conjured 3 bottles of wine for us, and that you will find them in the corner next to the oven. The farmer's poor wife brought out the wine which she had hidden, and she poured it for little Klaus and her husband, who made so many toasts to each other's health that they were soon very, very merry. Then the farmer began to think about little Klaus's sack and what a wonderful thing it must be to have a wizard. Do you think he could conjure the devil? The farmer asked. For now I have the courage. I wouldn't mind seeing what he looks like. Why not? Replied little Klaus. My wizard will do anything I tell him to. Won't you? He added, stepping on the sack so that it squeaked. Turning to the farmer, little Klaus smiled. Can't you hear that he said yes? But the devil has such an ugly face that he's not worth looking at. I'm not afraid, said the farmer, and he hiccuped. How terrible can he look? He looks just like the deacon. Returned the farmer. That's worse than I thought. I must confess I cannot stand the sight of a deacon, but now that I know that it's only the devil that I'll be looking at, maybe I can bear it. But don't let him come too near me, and let's get over with before I lose my courage. I'll tell my wizard, said little Klaus, and he stepped on the hide, and then he cocked his head as if he was listening to someone. What's he saying? Asked the farmer, who could only hear the hide squeak. He says that if we go over to the chest in the corner and open it up, we will see the devil sitting inside. But we must be careful when we lift the lid, not to lift it too high so the devil can escape. Then you must hold on to the lid while I lift it, whispered the farmer to little Klaus as he tiptoed to the chest in which the deacon was hiding. The poor fellow had heard every word that little Klaus and the farmer had said and was quaking with fear. The farmer opened the chest no more than an inch or two and peeped inside. "Ah!" he screamed, and he jumped up, letting the lid fall back into place. "I saw him. He looked exactly like our deacon. It was dreadful." After such an experience, you need a drink. And little Klaus and the farmer had many, for they drank late into the night. "You must sell me that wizard," the farmer finally said. "Ask whatever you want for it. I'll give you a bushel full of money, if that's what you'd like." "I wouldn't think of it," replied little Klaus. "You've seen for yourself all the marvelous things that wizard can do." "But I want it with all my heart," begged the farmer, and he kept on pleading with little Klaus until at last he agreed. "I cannot forget that you gave me a night's lodging," little Klaus said. "Take my wizard, but remember to fill the bushel basket to the very top." I shall," exclaimed the farmer. "But you must take the chest along too. I won't have that in my house. Who knows but the devil isn't still inside it?" And so that's how it happened. Little Klaus gave the farmer a sack with a horsehide in it, and in return was given not only a bushel full of money and a chest, but a wheelbarrow to carry them away. "Goodbye," called little Klaus, and off he went. On the other side of the forest, there was a deep river with a current that flowed so swiftly that you couldn't swim against it. But the river had to be crossed, and so a bridge had been built. When little Klaus reached the middle of the bridge, he said very loudly, so the deacon who was still inside the chest could hear him, "Oh, what's the point of dragging this chest any further? It's so heavy. You'd think it was filled with stones. I'm all worn out. But I know what I'll do. I'll dump the chest into the stream, and if the current carries it home to me, all well and good. And if not, doesn't matter." Then he took hold of the chest and he pushed it, as if he was about to lift it out of the wheelbarrow and let it fall into the water. "No, stop it!" cried the deacon from inside the chest. "Let me out, please let me out." "Ho, ho, ho!" shouted little Klaus, as if he was frightened. "The devil is still in there. I better throw this chest right into the river and drown him." "No," screamed the deacon. "I'll give you a bushel of money if you'll let me out." "Well, that's a different tune," said little Klaus, and he opened the chest. The deacon climbed out and shoved the chest into the river. Together, little Klaus and the deacon went to the deacon's home, where he gave little Klaus the bushel of coins that he had promised him. Now little Klaus had a whole wheelbarrow full of money. "That's not a bad payment for my old horse," he said to himself as he dumped all the coins out on the floor of his own living room. "What a big pile it is! It'll annoy Big Klaus to find out how rich I am now, all because of my horse. I won't tell him, but I'll let him find out for himself." So, a few minutes later, a boy banged on Big Klaus's door, bam, 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 and asked him if he could borrow his grain measure for little Klaus. "I wonder what he's going to use that for," thought Big Klaus, and in order to find out, he dabbed a little bit of tar on the bottom of the measuring pail, which was quite clever of him because when it was returned, he found a silver coin stuck to the spot. "Where did this come from?" shouted Big Klaus, and he ran as fast as he could to little Klaus's house. And when he saw little Klaus in the midst of his riches, he shouted even larger, "Where did you get all that money from?" "Oh, that was for my horsehide. I sold it last night." "You were certainly well paid," said Big Klaus, and he hurried home, where he took his axe and he killed all four of his horses. Then he flayed them and set off for town with their hides. "Hides for sale! Hides for sale! Who wants to buy hides?" Big Klaus shouted from street to street. All the shoemakers and tanners came out of their workshops to ask him the price of his wares. "A bushel full of coins for each hide," he replied. "You must be mad," they shouted at once. "Do you think we count money by the bushel?" "Hides for sale," he repeated. "Hides for sale." And every time that someone asked him the price, he said again, "A bushel full of coins." "Are you trying to make fools of us?" the shoemakers and the tanners shouted. And while the crowd continued to gather around them, the tanners took their leather aprons and the shoemakers their straps, and they began to beat Big Klaus. "Hides! screamed one of the tanners. "We'll see to it that your hide spits blood." "Out of town with him!" they shouted, and certainly Big Klaus did his best to get out of town as fast as he could. Never in his whole life had he gotten such a beating. "Little Klaus is going to pay for this," he decided when he got home. "He's going to pay with his life." But while Big Klaus was in town, something unfortunate had occurred. Little Klaus's grandmother had died, and although she had been a very mean and scolding hag who had never been kind to Little Klaus, he felt sad, very sad. Thinking that it might bring her back to life, he put his old grandmother in his own warm bed and decided to let her stay there all night, even though this meant that he would have to sleep in a chair. It was not the first time that Little Klaus had tried sleeping in a chair, but he couldn't sleep anyway. So he was wide awake when Big Klaus came and tiptoed across the room to his bed, in which he thought Little Klaus was sleeping. With an axe, Big Klaus hit the grandmother on top of the head as hard as he could. "That's what you get for making a fool of me," he explained, "and now you won't be able to do it again." And then he went home. "What a wicked man," thought Little Klaus. "If my grandmother hadn't already been dead, he would have killed her." Very early the next morning, he dressed his grandmother in her Sunday best, and then he borrowed a horse from his neighbor and harnessed it to a cart. On the small seat at the back of the cart, he put the old woman in a sitting position with bundles on either side of her so she wouldn't fall out of the cart while he was driving. He went through the forest, and just as the sun was rising, he reached an inn. "I'd better stop and get something to keep me alive," he said. It was a large inn, and the innkeeper was very rich. He was also very kind, but he had a ferocious temper, as if he had nothing inside him but pepper and tobacco. "Good morning," he said to Little Klaus. "You're dressed very finely for so early in the morning." "I'm driving to town with my grandmother," he replied. "She's sitting out in the cart because I couldn't persuade her to come in with me. I wonder if you'd be so kind as to take a glass of mead out to her, but speak very loudly because she's a bit hard of hearing." "No sooner said than done," answered the innkeeper, and he poured a large glass of mead, which he carried out to the dead woman. "Here's a glass of mead which your son has ordered for you," said the innkeeper, loudly but politely. But the dead woman sat perfectly still and let not out a word. "Can't you hear me?" he shouted. "Here is the mead from your son." He shouted the same words again as loud as he could, and still the old woman sat staring straight ahead. The more he shouted, the madder the innkeeper got, until finally he lost his temper and threw the mead, glass and all, right into the woman's face. With the mead dripping down her nose, she fell over backward, for Little Klaus had not tied her to her seat. "What have you done?" shouted Little Klaus as he flung open the door of the inn. "Why, you've killed my grandmother!" he cried, grabbing the innkeeper by the shirt. Look at the wound she has on her head." "Oh, what a calamity!" the innkeeper exclaimed, and he wrung his hands. "It's all because of that temper of mine. Sweet, good Little Klaus, I will give you a bushel full of money and bury your grandmother as if she were my own, so long as you'll keep quiet about what really happened. Because if you don't, they'll chop my head off, and that's so nasty." And that was how Little Klaus got another bushel full of coins. And the innkeeper, true to his word, buried the old woman as though he would have buried his own grandmother. As soon as he got home, Little Klaus sent his boy to borrow Big Klaus's grain measure. "What? Haven't I killed him?" Big Klaus exclaimed. "I must find out what happened. I'll take the measure over there myself." When he arrived at Little Klaus's and saw all the money, his eyes grew wide with wonder and greed. "Where did you get all that from?" he demanded. "It was my grandmother and not me that you killed, and now I have sold her body for a bushel full of money." "You were certainly well paid," said Big Klaus, and he hurried home. When he got there, he took an axe and killed his old grandmother. Then he dumped the poor old woman's body in his carriage and drove into town. He went at once to the apothecary and asked if he wanted to buy a corpse. "Who is it, and where did you get it from?" the apothecary inquired. Oh, it's my grandmother, and I've killed her so I could sell her body for a bushel full of money, Big Klaus said. God save us, cried the apothecary. You don't know what you're saying. If you talk like that, you'll lose your head. And the apothecary lectured him, telling him how wicked a crime murder was, and that it was committed only by the most evil of men who deserved the most severe punishment. And Big Klaus was terrified, and he leaped into his carriage, and he set off in the direction of his house, wildly whipping his horses. But nobody tried to stop him, for everyone believed that he had gone mad. I'm going to make you pay for this, Big Klaus cried as soon as he was well out of town. Little Klaus is going to pay for this, he repeated when he got home. Then he took a large sack and he went to see Little Klaus. So, you fooled me again, he shouted. First I killed my horses and then my grandmother, and it's all your fault. But you fooled me for the last time. And he grabbed Little Klaus around the waist and he shoved him into the sack. And as he flung the sack over his shoulder, he said very loudly, and now I'm going to drown you. It was quite far to the river, and as he walked, the sack with Little Klaus in it seemed to grow heavier and heavier. The road went past the church, and Big Klaus heard the organ being played and the congregation singing. You know, it'd be nice to hear a hymn or two before I go on, he thought. Everybody's in church, and Little Klaus can't get out of the sack, so Big Klaus put down the sack near the entrance, and he went into the church. Ah, poor me, sighed Little Klaus. He twisted and turned, but he couldn't loosen the cord that had been tied around the opening of the sack. At that moment, an old herdsman happened to pass. He had snow-white hair and walked with a long crook. In front of him, he drove a large herd of cows and bulls. One of the bulls bumped into the sack, and Little Klaus was turned over. Oh, poor me, cried Little Klaus. I'm so young, and I'm already bound for heaven. Ha! Think of poor me. I'm an old man, said the herdsman, and I'm not allowed to enter heaven. Well, open up the sack, shouted Little Klaus. You get inside instead of me, and then you'll go to heaven right away. Nothing could be better, said the old man, and he untied the sack, and Little Klaus crawled out at once. Take good care of my cattle, the herdsman begged, and he climbed into the sack. And Little Klaus promised that he would, and he tied the sack securely. Then he went on his way, driving the herd before him. A little later, Big Klaus came out of the church and he lifted the sack upon his back. He was surprised at how much lighter it was now, for the old man weighed only half as much as Little Klaus. How easy it is to carry now. It did me good to hear a hymn, he thought. Big Klaus went directly down to the river that was both deep and wide, and he dumped the sack into the water, shouting after it, You've made a fool of me for the last time. For of course he believed that Little Klaus was still inside the sack that was disappearing into the river. On his way home, he met Little Klaus with all his cattle at the crossroads. What? Exclaimed Big Klaus. Haven't I drowned you? Oh, yes, said Little Klaus. You threw me into the river about half an hour ago. But where did you get that huge herd of cattle? Big Klaus demanded. Oh, they're river cattle, replied Little Klaus. I'll tell you everything that happened to me. But, by the way, first I want to thank you for drowning me, for now I shall never have anything to worry about again. I'm really rich. Believe me, I was frightened when you threw me over the bridge. The wind whistled in my ears, and I fell into the cold water, and I sank straight to the bottom, but I didn't hurt myself because I landed on the softest, most beautiful green grass you can imagine. And then the sack was opened by the loveliest maiden. She was all dressed in white except for the green wreath in her wet hair. And taking my hand, she asked, Aren't you Little Klaus? When I nodded, she said, Here are some cattle for you, and 6 miles up the road there's an even bigger herd waiting for you. Then I realized that to the water people, the streams and the rivers are like roads to us. They follow the streams and the rivers until they finally become too shallow, and then they come to an end. There are the most beautiful flowers growing down there, and the finest, freshest grass, and the fish swimming around above your head remind you of birds flying around in the air. The people are so nice as they can be, and the cattle, fat and friendly. Then tell me why you came up here to be on the land again, asked Big Klaus. I never would have left a place as wonderful as that. Well, said Little Klaus, that's just because I'm smart. I told you that the water maiden said that another herd of cattle would be waiting for me 6 miles up the road. And by road, she meant the river, right? So I'm eager to see my cattle. You know how the river twists and turns while the road up here go on land goes straight? So I thought that if I used the road instead of the river, I'd get there faster. And I'd save myself at least 2 miles of walking. Oh, you are a lucky man, exclaimed Big Klaus. Do you think that if I were thrown into the river, I would be given cattle too? I don't know why not, replied Little Klaus, but I can't carry you as you did me. You're too heavy. But if you'll find a sack and climb into it yourself, I'll be glad to go to the bridge with you and push you into the water. Oh, thank you very much, said Big Klaus. But if I don't get a herd of cattle when I get down there, I'll beat you as you've never been beaten before. Oh, no, no, no. How can you think of being so mean? Whimpered Little Klaus as they made their way to the river. It was a hot day, and when the cattle spied the water, they started running towards it, for they were very thirsty. See? See how eager they are to get into the river, remarked Little Klaus. They're longing for their home under the water. Never mind them, shouted Big Klaus, or I'll give you a beating right here, right now. And he grabbed a sack that was lying on one of the bull's backs, and he climbed up on the bridge. Get a rock and put it in with me. I'm afraid I might float. Don't worry about that, said Little Klaus. But he found a big stone anyway, and he rolled it into the sack next to Big Klaus before he tied the opening as tightly as he could. And then he pushed the sack off the bridge. Splash! Plop! Down went Big Klaus into the river, and straight to the bottom he went. I'm afraid that he'll have trouble finding his cattle, said Little Klaus, and he drove his own herd home. That is the story of Little Klaus and Big Klaus by Hans Christian Andersen. A little darker than most fairy tales that we get in the nowadays, but still a fun tale. And there's plenty more in this book, so be glad to share those with you at another time. So, if you liked what you heard, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button if you'd like, and tune in next time when we have another installment from Hans Christian Andersen or any of the many other books that I'll be reading. Have yourself a good one.